I am so excited about today because today we launch into a series called Impossible Conversations. They're conversations that, quite frankly, it feels like it's often a lose-lose, but they don't have to be. So how can we win in some of these really difficult conversations? And I'm really excited because today I'm here with Ellen Radcliffe, and she's going to really help us, I believe, through your story and through your experience, as well as your clinical knowledge and everything that God's been doing in your life. You're going to really help us as we wade into the conversation on homosexuality and what is all this, how do we approach this subject and do it well and with grace and with God. And so that's what we're diving into. I'm really excited. And so let's just start with this because most of our people, they don't know you and they don't know your story. And so if you want, just take us back to the beginning and take us on an adventure with you and tell us your story.
Well, what an honor to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me. And I so appreciate and am moved by you and your church wanting to learn more about this. This is such a difficult area to talk about, especially in God's kingdom, especially in our world today. And so I so admire you guys' courage to really take this on. Well, I grew up in a faith tradition and a home based in God and faith, and I was well loved. I was well cared for. My parents certainly weren't perfect, but I knew I was loved. I always like to say I don't come from any trauma. There was no neglect in my life. But I grew up with this festering insecurity in my heart. I think the same insecurity that we all grow up with living outside of Eden, though we were created for Eden, that creates a natural insecurity. But I had even more so an insecurity, especially with my femininity. I grew up in a home where my dad was sort of the traditional stereotypical epitome of what a man is, right? Rough, tough, and gruff. And my mom is the opposite, sort of the traditional stereotypical epitome of femininity, gentle, quiet, nurturing. And I was and am still more like my dad in personality and in character. And so, though I'm very proud of it now, as a young girl with a tender heart and lots of insecurities and shame, that led me to the conclusion, to this distorted belief that something was wrong with me, that I was broken as a woman because I didn't match up to this bar of femininity that I created for myself. And that bar was my mom's example of femininity, which I couldn't naturally emulate. I didn't realize at the time there are multiple ways to be masculine, multiple ways to be feminine. So I walked around with this huge insecurity my whole life, looking for validation, especially in my relationships with other women, that I was woman enough, that I could be validated in that femininity. And so sort of out of that insecurity, I didn't really have any romantic prospects, so I looked for my validation in my same-sex friendships. And so out of that, place of insecurity, I befriended a girl. It started very innocently. I just admired her. She was a bit more like me. She was, passionate, outspoken, but she seemed okay about those parts of her, whereas I'd grown up so ashamed of those parts of me. And so what started as a very innocent admiration and friendship really quickly morphed into emotional enmeshment. And for me, idolatry. She became my sense of self and self-worth and identity. And all of that was completely wrapped up in her and in our friendship. And so when that sort of emotional enmeshment happens in a friendship, especially among women, because sexuality for women can be very fluid, it's usually driven by an emotional connection. The boundary lines of physical romantic connection were really blurred. And so we kind of blurred those lines, and then that kind of springboarded me into a life of homosexuality. And so I kind of ran from place to place, person to person, relationship to relationship, substance to substance, moved to Florida. Then I decided that's not far enough. I moved to Ireland. I thought that's where I'm going to find happiness and fulfillment. And I actually was so lonely. It was my, probably the loneliest I've ever been in my life, thinking this is it. I'm finally going to find it. And I think through that loneliness, God really eroded the hardness around my heart. And my dad actually stopped me and said, Ellen, I've been wanting to say this to you for a while, but you've looked all over the world for this sense of peace and happiness, fulfillment and identity that you've been searching for frantically. I wonder if it's time you start looking for that in God. And so that's kind of what prompted me to say, maybe I did miss something there with God. And so, it wasn't just this, maybe I'll give God another chance. I was so lonely and so broken down that I thought, who else do I have?
At your rock bottom, if you will. At your emotional rock bottom, at least. Yeah. And then where did you find did you go to a church in Ireland, or did you come back home, or?
I did. I went to church in Ireland. I was studying the Bible via Skype with some people here and with my parents, actually. And I visited a church there. I had to take the bus 6 hours to the south of Ireland. I was living way up in the north. And I had such a there was 6 people in that church. It was a really small church.
Wow.
And we had such a great weekend. They really took me in. And I had been studying the Bible for a little bit. And right before I left, we'd read Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. It says, surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear, but your sin has separated you from him. And that kept like echoing in my mind, in my heart. I had this moment with God where I was walking down this, abandoned road in Ireland. It was so beautiful. There were mountains and sheep on the mountains and snow-capped mountains in the background. And I was singing out loud and praying out loud. That was the lightest I'd felt up until that point, the happiest I'd felt. And I just sort of envisioned that I was holding God's hand on this road. And then we read Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. And I realized we couldn't hold hands. I couldn't be connected to God in the way that I wanted to be, the way that he wanted to be, because of my sin acting as a barrier between us. And so then I went to this church 6 hours away, had a great weekend, was definitely on this high, felt the presence of God there. And then I took that bus ride 6 hours back home. And every mile I got further and further away from the presence of God and these people, I just felt like that oppressive sadness and loneliness and achingness in my heart. So I got home at probably midnight, and I said, that's it. I can't keep living like this. I packed up. I was like carrying my stuff down the cobblestone streets of the little town I was living in at 2 o'clock in the morning, went to the train station, took a train to the airport, took the plane home, and I finished studying, became a Christian, decided to make Jesus Lord that day. And so, ever since then, haven't turned back.
I love that. Does your perspective on your entire sexual being change overnight? Was it for you, or was that a process? I
think it was a process. Truthfully, that was nowhere on my mind, right?
Yeah, that's so secondary.
So secondary. I think people ask me that a lot. Like, how did you reconcile this? Yeah. And that bus ride home, the train ride to the airport ride, or the airplane ride home, I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about, who is God? How does he see me? How much does he love me? How much do I love him? Right? So all of that was so secondary. It was very much like, I love you and we'll figure this out. And I remember I got home and my dad said, Ellen, I think if you read in the Bible that God wants you to jump off a bridge, you would do it because you love him that much. And I was like, I do. I'm all in. Right? And so, I think I just kind of reconciled slowly, right? Whatever God says, I'll do. I knew that, the biblical sexual and gender ethic was part of the Bible. I'd already had that belief. Yeah. I wasn't living that way prior to this moment in my life, but I knew that that's what the Bible said. And so I knew that was part of the deal when I signed up to live for God. But it wasn't a deterrent necessarily, because that was so secondary. What was most important to me was God's love. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, though, that you say it was so secondary, because I don't know, just my perspective of what it seems like culture is screaming is sexuality is primary, not secondary. How do you help someone else see it as also as secondary?
Yeah. Well, I don't mean to diminish the role of sex, sexuality, and gender as God's image bearers, right? That is so foundational to us as God's image bearers, so foundational to us understanding who God is, how he loves us, what he wants in a relationship with us. So certainly the topics of sex, sexuality, and gender are not secondary in the eyes of God.
Right.
But my identity as a lesbian is so secondary to my identity as God's daughter. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I realized in that moment, that yes, that was an important part of my identity up until that point. But I remember becoming a Christian and being so amazed by Colossians 3, 1-3, that says, my life is wrapped up in Christ with God. And I remember feeling this immense relief that all of these earthly notions I'd been chasing in my life, what brand of jeans I was into, what band I liked, what political party I was affiliated with, it's not that those aren't important, but they're so secondary to your primary identity as God's child. So that's kind of what I mean in terms of my identity. Yeah. All of a sudden things were clear, right? That it doesn't matter who you're sexually oriented toward. It's not that that's not important. God certainly cares about every facet of our life, but what's all encompassing is our identity in Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. So well said. Can we dive just a little bit into the theological argument on what does God say about sex?
Yeah.
And And how do you approach that subject with people, especially in today's day and age?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I had always kind of had that belief. I grew up in the faith tradition that believed that. So when I first became a Christian, I just thought, well, that's what we believe, right? That's what we believe.
Yeah.
And
marriage
then, of course,
between a man and a woman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so as I've, been a Christian, and this has become a bigger deal in our society, of course, this is now what I do for a living, I have had to dig in and figure out, what do I believe and why? And so I think that's a good process for any Christian to engage in. What I found in the Bible, we could talk for hours about what the Bible says about sex, sexuality, and gender. But I think, some important things that God says is, one, sex is foundational to us understanding who God is and what he wants in a relationship with us. That's not to say that we must engage in a sexual relationship on earth in order to understand him, but sex is a metaphor that he gives us to better understand the oneness and the intimacy that he wants to have with us, his bride. So historically, unfortunately, Satan has taken intimacy, and as part of that, sex, and said intimacy is just about sex and sex is just about physical attraction. And we, as God's ambassadors on this earth, have historically said, hey, that's true. Just don't do it before you're married and you'll be fine. Right? That's the only caveat we've put on this distortion, this desecration that Satan has put around intimacy and sex. And so I think what's really important to understand is that sex is so important in an experiential metaphor he's given us to better understand his love, the intimacy he wants to have with us. And as our creator and the creator of sex and intimacy, he says it's best lived out in the way that I've created, between one man and one woman in a monogamous, one flesh union in marriage, right? And us as his image bearers also play an important role. He created a man and a woman, right? Two genders. And that helps to make up our image as his image bearers. So there's lots of things in the Bible that I could use to corroborate that, but that is what I see in the Bible, that it's so important, so foundational. And it's not that, the Bible uses a lot of language like abhorrent, right? Or abomination, right? Homosexuality is an abomination. That word is used all throughout the Bible to describe lots of different practices that God didn't approve of. So I think it's important to know that homosexuality or crossing gender boundaries is not the only or the most sinful thing, but it is one of many things that God says is not the best way to live. And if we have agreed to live our lives for him, he says, I want you to remain within these boundaries because it's best for you.
You talked about relating with your dad more than your mom as a key part of your upbringing that caused kind of this internal sexual conflict, like who you related with in terms of gender. Do you think that was, is that a part of causing same-sex attraction? Or would you have said, I would have walked into that was a part of a core thing of who I was, regardless of who I related with?
Yeah. Oh, great question. And again, something else we could talk about for hours, because this is a question a lot of people have. Same-sex attracted people, gender dysphoric people, and parents or loved ones of the LGBTQ people have this question. How did this happen?
Yeah.
And I think there's an importance there, right? Like, we can understand to a certain point in our fallen state, right? We can understand to a certain point. And I do think that it's cathartic in a way to understand, how did this happen? How did this happen to me? I do think there comes a point, though, where we have to surrender. So to that, I would say, I always like to think about it like a cup, right? So if we have every non-innate trait that we have is both a product of biology and environment. It's kind of what we found out thus far in terms of modern science. So I would say for sure it makes sense that there was some sort of biological propensity that I had toward being attracted to other women. So if we think about it like a cup, maybe that made 30% of that, cup. And then 70% of my environment influenced that as well. And that flowed out to an overflowing trait, right? So I think what's tricky about the environmental causation, if you will, of it is that we can't perfectly pinpoint that, because a big part of environmental influence is perception. And no one else has the perception that I did, because no one else grew up exactly the way that I did, with the same brain, with the same experiences. Even if we took someone who had also 30% biological predisposition, let's say, toward being attracted to the same sex, and we put them in the exact same experiences that I had, they would walk out with a totally different trajectory in life, because they don't have the same perspective the same perception that I do. So again, we can understand up until a point, right? And I think, like my story, I think we always look for, their environmental influences must have included trauma or neglect or sexual abuse. Certainly that is categorized under environmental influences, but so are really little innocuous things like the shame that I carried from my femininity. I grew up in the South as a more passionate, an 8 on the Enneagram, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All of these things that are not inherently bad or sinful or fallen, they just are neutral realities, all came together to create this 70%, let's say, causation of environmental influence. So I do think that there's room to go back and say, what could have contributed toward this for me or my child or my loved one?
Yeah.
But I do think there's a point where we have to come and say, I understand to a point, but now I have to figure out, now what? What do I do with the reality? Do I serve myself or do I serve God with that?
Yeah. And so even for you, all right, so you would have said you were in a lesbian relationship, same-sex attraction. On the other side of giving your life to Christ, did same-sex attraction just melt away and go away? Or what was your process now dealing with your attraction?
Yeah.
And what is the Lord calling you to?
Yeah, no, it didn't melt away. And I think that's normal for all of us. When we're fallen, when we become a Christian, we're fallen after we're a Christian, right? We always have those temptations and those pulls. But then we have to decide, am I going to serve me or God with it? Yeah. And so I think in my early Christian walk, I walked around really afraid, especially of same-sex friendships, which we need. God says we need, right? We need that community of believers around us. And I think I entered same-sex friendships like this, like, I've gone down this path before. I don't want to do it again. I'm afraid to get too close to you. Fortunately, I, have worked through this enough to be able to welcome same-sex friendships in my life, but know what some boundaries are. And that took a lot of trial and error at first. So no, it didn't melt away, but at the heart of the ache in my heart, to be seen, to be known, to be understood, to be loved and adored, that was kind of fueling my pursuit of any romantic relationship. That would have fueled my pursuit of a heterosexual or a homosexual relationship. And so what I can go back to is that ache in my heart that fuels my pursuit of same-sex relationships is now quelled because I know who I am. I know where I can find that unconditional, perfect love that I was created for. And any friendship or any other kind of relationship outside of that is just kind of the cherry on top of my relationship with God.
Yeah. All right. So you have other relationships, including you're married. You have a husband.
Yeah.
You've got a couple kids.
I do.
So how, this might be kind of a strange question. How does that work with your husband? Like, how'd you guys meet? How'd you look at him and go, I think this is the one for me? Like, how did that all play out for you, especially with your past?
Yeah, well, that is probably the most common question I get is, how does that work? I get asked that all the time. How does that work? I would say, well, I didn't fall in love with my husband the way that probably maybe most heterosexually attracted people do. I didn't look at him and think, wow, what a gorgeous guy. But I did get to know, we were friends, and so I got to know his heart really well. Yeah. And what I really, all of our friend group around us, they had said to us for years, hey, have you ever considered Ellen? And Ellen, have you ever considered Paul? And we would talk about it together and say, isn't that ridiculous?
Really?
They want us to get together. Yeah, we were good friends, but there was nothing romantic or anything like that between us. And then one day the scales kind of fell off, and he looked at me in this way that was a little bit more possessive than he ever had. And I thought, well, that's weird. And that was the first time that I really kind of considered, oh, maybe this could be a romantic prospect. And so, yeah, how does that work is that I like to talk about intimacy and connection, especially in romantic relationships, as a stool. And so we live in a world that says physical attraction is foundational to romantic love.
Yeah. The stool is one post.
Exactly.
And that's just
one post of physical attraction. I'm a marriage and family therapist. If a couple comes into my office and says, we got married because we're really attracted to each other, we've got a big problem.
Yeah. Right? You're like, I know where this is going to go. Because they're not always going to be looking so good.
Exactly. That stool's going to topple over 100% of the time. Because you're right. Yeah. In 10 years, your husband is not going to look the same as they do now. And your hormones are going to change and fluctuate. And you're going to have children. And your stage of life is going to change. All of that affects our sexual arousal, our physical attraction, right? Template. And so, I think if we think about it like a stool, I might have one gimpy leg on our stool of intimacy. Me and my husband, my physical attraction to him is maybe a little bit gimpy. But we have lots of other legs on that stool of intimacy that help us have a really secure level of intimacy and connection. So our shared values, our partnership in the gospel, our partnership in parenting, or the laughter that we have together, right? Yeah. All of those other ways that we connect, sort of like a blind person having to enhance their other senses, right? We've had to do that with our connection. And I think a lot of times people pity me or maybe pity my husband because I don't feel the same kind of attraction toward him that maybe heterosexually attracted women would. But I don't think we feel that the need for that pity. I think really I pity or have compassion for people who only have that one leg of physical attraction, because I know that it's not very stable and secure and it will topple over. I'll add too that female sexuality is much more fluid than we've ever understood, certainly much more than male sexuality. So I actually do have some attraction toward my husband. I don't know how it compares to my heterosexual peers, or heterosexually attracted peers, their attraction toward their husband. I do have some attraction toward my husband. But for me, that attraction didn't start, and even now isn't really fueled by the way that he looks, although I think he's a handsome guy.
I've seen him. He's a handsome
guy, right? But it's more so fueled by the safety that I feel with him, the being known, being adored by him, right? Yeah. Again, not through a physical lens, but more him knowing me and loving me, and that safety I feel with him. So, that's kind of how that works.
Yeah. And you talked about it in your book, which I read her book yesterday. It's excellent.
Thank you.
I'll reference it again later. But you talked about sexual arousal actually is more than just visual.
Yes.
It's all these components that speak into what actually becomes attractive, or what attracts us, from spiritual, emotional. All these things can actually be stimuli.
Yeah.
So fascinating. Can we go back to a little bit back to your upbringing?
Yeah.
Because I want to go back there for a little bit, because I want to know, you didn't pinpoint it, but at what age were you? You said you grew up knowing I didn't feel like I fit in. A lot of insecurity there. When was that young relationship, that same-sex relationship? When did you first kind of feel like I'm stepping into this same-sex attraction?
Yeah, I don't know if I can really pinpoint a moment. I mean, so when I entered into a same-sex relationship, I was probably 16, maybe. Okay. And before then, I had noticed that there was some attraction toward other women. For me, it usually started with admiration, right? And even now, if I have to be on guard with that in my life, and I have to be not wary, because I think admiration is such a positive thing that God gave us to be able to imitate others and, godly behavior. But whenever I feel admiration, I'm no longer scared of it, but I am aware that, hey, this could quickly morph into emotional enmeshment or idolatry for me. But I think even before 16, I recognize now, I didn't recognize then, that I was very drawn to emotional enmeshment and idolatry with other women. And that's what I hear for a lot of women, is what is kind of the precipitating factor to move into a physical relationship. Because for women, it is tied to, physical arousal is very tied to their emotional connection and safety. So for a lot of teenage girls, we mostly feel connected to our female peers, not to our male peers. Yep. And so this happens a lot, especially for female girls growing up in their preteen and teen years. And so I noticed that. I also noticed a few other things. I didn't feel comfortable in my body. I didn't feel comfortable as a woman. I thought, wouldn't life be so much easier if I were a man? Even things like my clothing, I thought, I'd much prefer to wear a suit than, a blouse and some slacks. Like, come on, that doesn't seem to fit me. And then I also noticed some things like celebrities or people on the TV, right? I would have some sort of physical arousal or physical attraction toward them. And that wasn't really a red flag for me. I didn't really think about it much. I was too young. But then when I was really prone to this emotional enmeshment with other women, then I started to think about it more and think, I think I'd feel safe in a relationship with other women. Yeah.
And how did your parents handle it when you came out?
Well, we were afforded an opportunity that not a lot of parents or families are afforded in this. Because my parents read a diary entry that I had, and so they found out years before I actually told them. Oh. So what was really difficult for them is that they had to kind of silently move through this. But what was really great for us in the long run was that I didn't get the merging of their emotional reaction, their fear-based reaction on the spot. They had 2 years to process through this, grieve together, mourn together, figure out a game plan for their heart. Together with God and with each other and with their own little support system. And then when I finally came out to them years later, their response to me literally was, we know and we love you. And that was so relieving to me, because I didn't feel like I needed to manage their reaction through this. They could be freed up to just steward my heart in this instead of me getting the full brunt of their emotions and then having that be tied into their stewardship of me. Yeah.
And were they, I can imagine as pastors, pastoring a church, that might have been difficult for them. Were were they able to just go, well, I guess we can't stop you, or we allow this? I mean, it probably wasn't, hey, we blessed this, but how did you feel going through that next season in terms of how they, what boundaries did they set for you?
Yeah, so my parents were in ministry, and that would, I think, probably added an added layer for them as they were processing through this, because probably what they had to deal with, what I meet with a lot of people, parents who have LGBTQ children, what they have to work through is their grief, their regret, their guilt, and their shame. And a lot of that shame has to do with the church culture that they're a part of. And I would say a lot of that shame that I've seen in parents usually come from ministers or people who have some sort of position in God's kingdom, shepherding other people. And they think, oh no, is this going to jeopardize people's perception of me or my influence in this part of God's kingdom? And so I'm sure my parents went through that. What I really appreciate about my parents and the way that I was raised is that they put an emphasis more on being real than on the look of being right, you know? Yeah. And so, I think, well said. I think that they felt all of those things that any other parent, any other minister would feel. But I think, my parents were the people who would walk into church and someone say, how you doing? And they'd be like, we're doing terrible. We just had a fight in the car. Let's talk about it, Wow. So I kind of grew up seeing that as an example. And I think that probably really helped them move through this to say, yeah, we do feel ashamed. Yeah, we do feel that pull for all of that. But what's most important here is that we go about this in a way that honors God and seeks to love and protect Ellen, no matter what people think of us, right? So I think that was a big part of how they handled it. Now, when I came out to them, when I told them, my girlfriend and I had already broken up. So I think that probably lessened the tension a little bit too. I wasn't actively in a same-sex relationship, though I was open to it. I wasn't really sure where I was going to go with my future romantic relationships when I came out to them. But I think that helped lessen the tension. And at that point, I was probably 19 and I wasn't living at home. And so I think that helped too. They didn't really have executive control over me anymore. They certainly had influence. But they knew while I was still living in their home, and they decided not to confront me about it. And I don't think they decided to do that because it's always wrong to confront when you find this out. I think they decided to do that because they knew me, and they knew that if they were to confront me about this, I would put the walls up. It wouldn't do any good. It would only separate us. And so they decided to wait until it felt like the right time. And I happened to bring it up to them. So I don't think that's always the right recourse for Christian parents, but I do think it requires some being adept and being, listening to the Spirit, listening to God to figure out when is the right time, how is the right way to bring this up.
What did the church do that was good, and what did the church do that was bad?
Well, I think the church that I grew up in, I wouldn't say I would go back and say, you did this wrong. This was wrong. This was bad. I think they did the best they could with what they had, right? And I would say that for my parents too, growing up. They did the best they could with what they had. Yeah. Was it perfect? By no means. Yeah. And I don't think any parent, any church is going to do it perfectly. There's just not an opportunity that's available to us outside of Eden. But what I do wish, had they known, right, my parents and the church that I grew up in, had they known to make it less about behavioral compliance and make it more about a relationship with God. I actually feel fortunate. I did grow up in a faith tradition that really valued a personal relationship with God, but even still, I think there could have been more of an emphasis on that. And I think that not so much in my home growing up, but in the church culture I grew up in, it was very much, if you become a believer at this age and you're not engaging in this activity or that, piece of sin, then you're good. You're a good Christian. Yeah, that would define a good Christian. And so I wish that we would have had some more space to say, even if you are going through that or you're pulled toward that, it's more so about your relationship with God, knowing how much He loves you and how much He wants to be connected with you, rather than your behavioral compliance. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, I have seen Christians just at large really go too much in that vein. My first gay pride parade as a proud lesbian at the age of probably 17 or 18, I walked into this pride parade and I was so excited, right? And I felt the same level of excitement that I felt growing up in church when I would walk into a Sunday morning. And I thought, these are my people, where I belong, where I can just be. The same level of relief that I saw some of the Christians growing up walking into church, what they would feel is, oh, I'm with my people. I just belong here. Yeah. So I was feeling that really pure sense of belonging. I was looking for it in the wrong place, granted, right? God says, that if you feel that way here, imagine how much more you'd feel that way in my community of believers. But what I was feeling and what I was chasing was good. It just was not as good as what God offers. And so as I'm walking into this gay pride parade, I start to hear angry shouts. And
Yeah.
as I tune in, I see these people literally standing on soapboxes. I thought that was fake. That's real. They're standing on soapboxes with a Bible, screaming words of hate and condemnation. And I think similarly, they got it. What they were saying was right. This is sinful. But the way they were saying it was so wrong that I couldn't hear the right in it. Because what I thought in that moment is, if this is who God is, I want no part of it. I want to belong. I want to feel safe. I want to feel loved. And that is not how I feel around these representatives of God. They were making it so much about behavioral compliance with their faith that they forgot to tell me the good news. God loves you and he wants to know you. They really missed the boat there.
Help the church out. Just for, you're talking about the process. Even I feel like you were just even leaning into it there about what the church, a bad response, but also what the church needs to do. And so help us out. Let's kind of take a 50,000 foot view and talk about language, though, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Like, just get us all on the same page. What are some of what's the verbiage that we should be using when we're talking to people who are in a homosexual relationship?
Yeah.
What about same-sex, gay, same-sex attraction, historical view of marriage? Like, what's offensive? What would put them on edge? What would turn someone off?
Yeah.
How do we approach this?
Well, first, a couple of things to consider. First, I would say, if your conscience will allow, and I think that's where we need to start, is with our conscience. There are things in the Bible that are black and white, right, that are very clear. Yeah. Then there are lots of principles in the Bible that we have to apply to a very modern world. And I think one of those areas is terms, right? It doesn't say in the Bible, you need to abide by this standard, but if someone doesn't live by my standard, this is what you should and shouldn't call them or say, right? So I think when in matters like that in the Bible that are maybe a little bit more gray, we have to apply a principle. We have to wrestle a little bit. We're not really comfortable with wrestling as humans. I feel like we like it to be easy, clear cut, black and white, but we all need to get adept at wrestling as Christians. So we have to start with our conscience. What will my conscience allow? If your conscience will allow you to use some of the verbiage, I would say use the verbiage that they use, right? That's going to make them feel most comfortable.
Okay.
And if your conscience can't, it doesn't allow you to use that verbiage, that's okay. I think there's a way to communicate it to that person that says, I love you. I respect you. I can't in good conscience use this language, but here's what I am willing to do. Here's where I'm willing to meet you. And so I think what's most important here, we get so caught up on the terms, and I get it, right? We live in a culture that says, if you don't use this term, you're against me, you hate me.
Yeah.
And I think we need to kind of rise above that a little bit and say, wait a minute, terms are just terms, right? What's most important to me, and I think what's most important to you, is that I desperately want to know you. And more importantly, God really wants to know you.
Yeah.
And if that's our heart, like, I'm a therapist, right? I don't always say the right thing. But what I do have going for me with my clients is that I really want to know them. And I really want to know them deeply, authentically. And I want to have compassion for them no matter what. And so if we have that heart with people, God says, out of the overflow of our hearts, our mouths speak. I trust that we'll have maybe not the right words, but that relationship can withstand if we don't have the right words, because that person can sense our hearts.
How about when talking with Christians, though, who are using terms like, for example, the difference between a Christian saying, well, I'm a gay Christian versus I'm a Christian with SSA, same-sex attraction. You talk about that in your book of where you land and why you land there. Even walk us through that.
Yeah, well, so I personally would refer to myself as a same-sex attracted Christian, or a Christian who experiences same-sex attraction, because for me, my identity is central in my relationship with God, right? So a Christian is my foundational identity, but I'm a Christian who experiences same-sex attraction. That helps to describe my experience with my sexual attraction. It doesn't describe who I am at the core. I do know other Christians who believe in the exact same biblical and sexual ethic that I do that would say, well, I'm a gay Christian. And they mean the exact same thing that I do. I have no problem, right? I don't think God says, hey, this word is
living
sinful.
A celibate. Yeah.
They're living celibate, or they're married in a mixed orientation marriage, and they believe in the biblical sexual and gender ethic marriage between one man and one woman. But that vernacular is more comfortable to them. I'm a gay Christian. And by that, they mean the same thing that I do, but that more accurately describes their experience. I have no problem with that term.
Yeah.
I don't think God's up there like, I can't believe they use that sinful word. I don't think words are sinful. I think our hearts are sinful in whatever way we use them. So I think what we really want to be careful of is idolatry, or, making that part of our life our identity. That's where it could become sinful, or certainly acting out, on that same-sex sexual temptation could become sinful. But the word itself, I don't think is sinful. But I personally feel more comfortable with same-sex attracted, but other people feel more comfortable with gay Christian. I think what's more important is we have to get to the story, right? And so we can say, what does that mean to you? Help me understand.
Yeah, again, why would you use that term over another one?
Yeah, help me understand what that means to you. What do you mean by that? And we get to know the story. I think that's more important than the terms that they use.
Yeah, and I think even as you said in the book, I'll probably say it incorrectly, but if I'm trying to boil it down, the reason why you would steer clear of the term gay is the propensity for others to associate that with the action,
right,
with the behavior, as opposed to attraction.
Right. To me, it's just confusing, right?
Yeah.
If I say I'm a gay Christian, then there's always going to have to be an explanation around that. Usually,
people are does behavior follow that?
People are going to assume that it does. I would think, right? Because also, what a gay Christian means in our modern world is, I'm a Christian who disagrees with your theology. I live my life for God in every other area, but I believe that the Bible says that acting on same-sex sexual temptations, as long as it's within the confines of a monogamous marriage, even between two men or two women, is righteous, right? I don't agree with that theology. Right. Someone could say I'm a gay Christian and mean that. So for me, being a gay Christian is confusing. That's why I use the term same-sex attracted. But even if someone doesn't, that's fine. We can get past that. We just want to understand the underlying heart of that. Yeah,
and be able to get to, okay, what do you mean by that?
Exactly.
How do we minister effectively to our friends and family members who are in the homosexual lifestyle right now? Like, what's our best approach?
Yeah. Well, I think our best approach is making it about a relationship, right? We live in this world, like we said earlier, where your sexual attractions, your gender identity is paramount to who you are. But we know, as people who live for God, that's just not true. It's not that it's not important. It's not that God doesn't care. It's that who you are is God's. And so if we have that perspective, we can walk through the distortions of this world in that messy middle space, right? Where we can say, I unconditionally love you no matter what, but I still hold personally to unwavering righteousness. And both can exist in this messy middle. You might be uncomfortable with it, but I don't have to be uncomfortable. God's certainly not uncomfortable. I still want to know you. He wants to know you. It's going to put people's walls up if we say what you're doing, what you believe, who you believe you really are to your core is wrong. Like, nobody's going to be like, tell me more. That sounds so interesting. I feel so safe right now, right? What we want to do is say, I know you want to be loved and you want to be adored and you want to belong. And you are getting those needs met in some degree in the LGBTQ community. I'm so glad you're getting those needs met. But if you think you feel adored and you belong here, just wait until I tell you about God and his kingdom, right? Like, we don't want to say all of this is terrible. We can validate the underlying desire that people have while still pointing them to a better way to get those very legitimate needs met.
What if you are in a conversation with someone who's, let's say, in a gay relationship and they're acting on it, they're living a homosexual lifestyle, and you want to invite them to church because ultimately you know that God wants a relationship with them. Like, God having a restored relationship with everyone is paramount. That's where everything begins. And yet they come back to you and they go, okay, but is your church affirming? How do you even approach that to go? Because all of a sudden they're making it about, is your church affirming, as opposed to really what we want to bring people to, which is to Jesus Christ.
That's right, to a relationship with him, Well, I would say, if at all possible, I wouldn't have that conversation right then, right there, right? I wouldn't say yes or no, or here's what we believe, here's what we don't believe, because that's already an emotionally charged conversation, right? We want to have this conversation in a neutral setting where we're both a little bit less emotionally charged. So if at all possible, I would say that is such a great question, and I really want to unpack that with you. Could we get together this weekend and discuss it over coffee, right? And if they keep pressing the issue, I would say, there's so much more to unpack here. I think what's most important is God loves you. He wants to know you. He wants to be in a deep relationship with you. That's what's most important. And as our creator, if we agree to live for him, we do abide by his manufacturer's instructions, right? What he lays out in the Bible, his standards. And one of his many standards is that, yes, we remain in a one flesh union between one man and one woman if we decide to get married. That's the way we steward our sexuality. But if you don't agree to live that way, he still loves you, right? I think that's so foundational to what we have sort of missed historically as Christians is surrendering to the God-given free will that he's given every person to live their life however they want to. It's not up to us as Christians to restore Eden. We don't have that power. We can't force people into behavioral compliance. That has to stem, right? John 14:15 says, if you love me, then you'll obey me.
Yeah.
He doesn't ask just for our behavioral compliance. He asks for our love. And the way we show him our love is living by those manufacturer's instructions. But us imploring people to live through this behavioral compliance is not really what God wants. He wants them. He wants their heart. We don't want to miss the boat and tell them, you have to, I didn't come to God thinking, ooh, this list of do's and don'ts looks so exciting, right? That's not what made me make the jump. It was, this is what I've always wanted, to be loved in this way. And out of that overflowing love, I'll do anything he says to do or not to do. That's what we want to help foster in people.
So what about to the person who goes, I love God, but I also feel like he is behind my relationship that is not inside of what we would see God's manufacturing guidelines for marriage.
Well, I would have some questions for that person, right? I'd say, where can you point me in the Bible where you see that? And right, probably nowadays there's lots of, scriptures people can point to. I don't think those really hold any merit, but, lots of sound bites they've been given through pro-gay theology. And I would say, what's your basis for understanding? Let's look at the Greek. Let's look at the Hebrew. Or what resources do you have? And can I bring some to the table too? And let's wrestle through this together. I don't agree with that theology, but I do think there's a way that we could talk about this openly and respectfully and try to have compassion and understanding for one another, even if we'll never agree on this.
And I think maybe that might be the harder thing for people to swallow, but that's probably the best thing is like, you may never agree, but can we head into the conversation genuinely willing to kind of wrestle through this?
It's really messy, right? Because churches will split over this and, people won't agree on this and people will get really heated about this. I don't think that's what God wants, but I think there is a way to disagree, but disagree respectfully and lovingly. And then we'll let God do what he does and sort it out in the end, right? That's not really up to us.
Yeah. What resources exist out there for those who are processing same-sex attraction and they're going, all right, I believe in God, but these are my emotions that I'm feeling. How do I process this?
Yeah. Well, there's some great resources. In fact, I have a carefully curated list of resources on my website, heartsetabove.com. And it breaks it up into different needs, right? If you're a same-sex attracted Christian, here's some resources for you. If you're the parent of a LGBTQ child, here's some resources. If you're the parent of a young child, trying to teach them about sex, sexuality, and gender, here's some resources. I even have a section for people who want to engage with pro-gay theology. So I'm not afraid of people engaging with that. I think we're called to test and approve our faith. And, certainly I don't think God hopes that our theology would change, but I think it's good to know what we believe in, why, and if that means engaging with different perspectives, I think that's a really healthy thing. So I would say first check out my website, heartsetabove.com. Probably the best resource that anyone could be offered in such a difficult time, wrestling through something so controversial and tender, is community, right? So I think one of the best resources is through an organization that I work with, strengthinweakness.org. We have peer support groups for Christians who experience same-sex attraction and for parents of LGBTQ kids. And that has been such a solace to so many people going through this, because what we need most is to feel like we're not alone in this. Gabor Mate is a famous psychologist, and he says, the human spirit is really quite resilient. We can get through a lot, but what we can't get through is going through it alone. And so we need some community around us. We can turn to our churches, to our little support, certainly to God for that camaraderie, that community, that sense of belonging as we're moving through something so difficult.
Let's talk parenting. Your book, I'm just going to say, I'm going to give a plug. I think this is a book that every parent needs to own. Love Covers All, or Love Covers Over, just came out, right? Like just last month or something like that. It is excellent. Seriously, this is the best book. You go all the way through child development. I mean, year by year, kind of age 2 through 4, 4 through 7, middle school. I mean, all the way through kind of here's what you need to be processing with your kids. Here's how you parent them through understanding Bible or their body, sexuality, all these different things. And so how do parents, I know there's a big, broad question. How do parents parent kids well in a very sexually confused time that we live in right now? I mean, can we win here?
Well, sure, yeah, but it depends on what you mean by win. That's where I would say this all starts, is I hopefully give lots of practicals in the book, and I'll say some in just a second, but I think for parents, we really have to start with grieving well and surrendering. I'm only 6 years into parenting, and I've already experienced so much grief, right? When I was pregnant with my oldest, my husband and I were watching a movie one night, and I just started crying out of the blue, and he was like, "What's wrong? What's going on?" And I said, life is about to change. Like, we won't be able to do this forever, right? So even good changes that happen in our life comes with something lost, something to grieve.
Yeah.
I also feel like I'm kind of in pre-grief with my kids right now, right? They're young and so tender-hearted and vulnerable. And when I see that, it's so beautiful and it warms my heart. But I know that we don't live in Eden the way that they were created.
Yeah, right.
And that vulnerability, that innocence will be stolen from them slowly as they age. And so whenever I see that, I'm warmed in my heart, but I'm also in pre-grief that I will watch that innocence ebb away. So I'm only 6 years in here, and I already know parenting is one big lifelong exercise in grief and surrender. And so I would tell parents, no matter how old your kids are, no matter if they've come out or you think they will or won't, start learning to grieve and grieve well. Turn to God in your grief. Get a little support system around you. Learn how to not put that emotional reaction on your kids, but to steward them in a surrendered way, while not putting all of your emotions on them, right? So that's where we have to start, is with our heart.
And which really applies to all areas of their life. I mean, not just sexuality. It's everything that they do that you might find disappointment in.
Exactly.
To be able to go like, oh, that was such a miss, or that was such a loss, or whatever, and be able to surrender that to the Lord.
Which is going to, be many things throughout your child's life, right?
Yes.
When they're young and older, and when they're grown. So you would do well to get adept at that now.
Yeah.
And then I would say the other thing, sort of on a more heart level, is two things. One, like we said, we never want to get our kids confused that we're more interested in their behavioral compliance than in their heart for God and their knowing of God. So that's what we want to do. I always encourage parents to teach your children who God is. Every conversation you have with your child about some of those core aspects of God's nature, his unconditional love, the free will that he gives, his standards of righteousness and obedience, grace and free will, right? All of those conversations help to build the building blocks of having this overall conversation with your kids about sex, sexuality, gender, LGBTQ topics. So we don't want to miss the boat and make their behavior comply out of our fear. We want to teach them lovingly who God is. I like to use this term surrendered stewardship because, like the parable of the talents, right? God, or the master in that story, held his servants to account, not necessarily for what they produced, but for how they stewarded what they were entrusted with. And I think each of us as parents will be called to the carpet one day and say, how did you steward what I entrusted you with, my precious child, right? And I don't think we'll be called to account on whether our child became a Christian, what they did in their sin, what they did with their temptations. I don't think that's the measure of our success. I think the measure of our success is how we went about it. So that's part of the answer here, is change your perspective. Your measure of success is not your child's behavior. It is how you, in your heart, stewarded what was entrusted to you. The rest of that is up to God and your child and the free will that God has given them. But I would say practically, when you want to teach your kids about sex, sexuality, and gender, you want to start with teaching them about God's nature, who he is, what God wants in a relationship with them. We never want to miss that boat. But then also teach them about the body. That's a great place to start. What is our body? What are the proper terms for our body? Let's not use euphemisms. Let's talk about the body in its full splendor, right? It's amazing how God made the body. There's no shame in it. Just like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, there might be more vulnerable parts of the body that deserve extra care and protection, but there are no shameful parts of the body. So that's a great way to kick off this conversation. Another thing to bring up, even from an early age, is gender stereotypes that this world holds to that God doesn't hold to. So we want to be talking about that from an early age. And I think the most important thing is that this is not a conversation to have with your kids. This is a series of conversations as they age, as they grow up, that will compound on each other. It starts with who God is, his nature, starts with who your child is and their identity as his beloved creation, starts with talk about the body, talk about gender roles as laid out by God, not by the world. And then we kind of compound from there.
How early should we be entering into the conversation or helping even our kids, even if they haven't yet seen it or maybe are about to? You have that sense that they're probably going to run into it. Same-sex attraction, homosexual relationships, things like that. When do you broach that subject? Is it once they accidentally saw, hey, you were walking down the street and there was two men holding hands or two men kissing, and then you follow up the conversation? Or do you try to get in front of that conversation?
As much as possible, I try to get in front of that conversation. So you don't want to do it too early because your child might not be able to understand, right? I have a 6-year-old and we've started talking about the body and a little bit about sex. We're starting to enter into that conversation with him because he's in kindergarten now and he might encounter some of that in school. But these more nuanced conversations about same-sex relationships we might see in our daily life, I think it's great to teach our kids, right? This is what's true in our world, because part of our role as stewards is to orient them to the fallen world that we live in. So what's true about our world is that there are people who are in same-sex relationships. There are 2 men or 2 women who are married, or they might even have a family, right? Here's what's true about the way that we live. We live for God's standard. Here's what he says. And then you always want to follow it up with love and compassion, right? Does our theological belief change our love for those people who don't live the way that we do? No, of course not. Here's how God says we need to treat them: with love, with compassion, with respect, no matter what. So that's a good framework to teach our kids about some of these nuanced topics like same-sex relationships. So as much as possible, I'd get ahead of that. And you can utilize, if you start to feel, what's important here is that parents have regular times of reflection. Because if they don't, then life is just happening and then they're reacting to it with their kids. It's a really poor model for parenting. We want to set aside time, preferably every week, to get on top of our parenting and say, I'm going to reflect. How are my kids doing? They're this age. They're maybe encountering this in their culture, in our culture. What do I need to be talking to them about now, right? So when we're kind of on top of it, then we can be on the lookout for opportunities. If you saw a commercial or a TV show or a movie where this was mentioned, even subtly, the next time you get together with your child in more of an intimate setting, you can say, hey, buddy, I know we watched this on the TV the other night. What did you think about that? Do you have any questions? Let me lay this out for you as this template. This is what's true of this world. This is what's true about how God calls us to live. This is how we treat them with love and compassion no matter what.
That's so well said. The idea of setting your child up or setting up regular times to get to your child's heart and to connect with them. You talk about devotions and really how devotions for you became a heart check moment. And it wasn't necessarily every day, but the regular, hey, we're going to talk about this at devotions next time. And so unpack that a little bit as well. Yeah,
I would say if a parent said, what's the most important thing I could do right now? It would be setting up times of what I would call intentional connection. When I was growing up, we called it family devotionals. And so when we were younger, this looked like we would learn about God, right? We talked about Noah and the ark, and my mom would spray us with water, simulating the flood, and my brother would be the neighbor of Noah's, making fun of him, like, what are you doing, right? So we learned about God's word in a way that was really fun. And then as we got older, this was a time for us as a family to talk about real life stuff that we had questions about. And, I've heard broken-hearted parents say to me, I can't believe my child didn't talk to me about this. I have an open door policy. They know that they can talk to me about anything. And I get that. And I think that's great to have an open door policy with your kids. I just don't think that's enough. I think sometimes we need to implement and say, hey, do you have questions about this? If I were you, I might have this question, because our kids don't know what they don't know, right? Like
That's a good way of saying it. If I were you, I might be asking this question.
If I were you, growing up in this way, or I might be confused about this. Are you? If you were, here's what my response to that would be. Again, that can't happen unless we as parents first have times of reflection to get on top of parenting instead of being afflicted by it. But building in this regular time with your family to talk through some of these big life moments or big key things in life about God and about the life that we live in this world is going to be really important as you steward your family through these difficult topics.
If you sense that your child is dealing with same-sex attraction, how would you encourage a parent to approach a conversation like that?
Yeah. Well, I think it really depends on the child.
Okay.
First, I would say don't be ruled by your fear. That is 100% of the time going to end in failure. And so I've had a conversation with a mom years ago, and actually I had a conversation with her daughter, and the mom had this fear. I think my child might be gay. I think she might grow up to be gay. I think she might even be trans, right? She's uncomfortable in her body. And she kept pestering her child about it. And her daughter eventually told me, I never thought I was, but my mom keeps asking me, I must be, right? And actually she is now living in a same-sex relationship and pursuing transitioning to a different gender. So I would say be careful, because our fear instills shame and distortion for our children. So what's less important is what you do. What's more important is how you go about it. If you want to have these conversations in fear or not have these conversations in fear, you're already wrong. So go to God first, work through that fear, that grief, that shame, that regret, whatever it is. Then out of that rooted, surrendered stewardship, then navigate what's best for my child, for my family unit as a whole. Do I bring it up? Do I not? Right? That's going to depend from child to child, family to family. But I think what's much more important is don't go about those conversations in your fear. Do it in your love.
Is it just the tone? It's not just the tone, because it's the heart of the parent has been transformed.
That's it.
How would a parent know I've made it? I'm not, like, in the sense that I'm ready for the conversation. Fear no longer holds my heart.
Right.
Because I think entering into that conversation, if you really believe it is the case, I don't know how you would even approach that without being like, I am really nervous at the very least.
Right.
But not allowing fear to dominate the conversation. So how do you know that you're there?
Yeah, I love that you asked that in that way, because that's such a great point, that it's not that fear won't be a part of it, because it will be. You will still be afraid. You'll still be nervous. You'll still maybe dread it in some ways. I would say, I always like to think about in Ephesians 6, where it talks about the armor of God. And I was always baffled by that last part that said, let your feet be fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. I always thought, how could those two things go together? How can someone be like battle ready with peace in their heart, right? That didn't go together for me until I saw how my parents reacted. They had worked through some of their big grief and fear and emotions with God. And I got to see their peaceful readiness. They said, essentially their sentiment to me was, we're not afraid. God is above it, right? That doesn't mean they weren't fearful. They weren't uncomfortable. They wanted this to happen, right? But they were saying, we know who God is. We know who you are to God. And we know what you're really searching for, even if you don't. So I don't think you'll ever feel ready or excited to have these conversations with your kids. I certainly think fear will always be a part of it. But if fear is ruling you, then you're not ready. You need to have that peaceful rootedness, not to feel relaxed about it necessarily, but to feel ready for whatever may come, because you are rooted in the truth of God. I have a client who was working through some stuff in her life, and she said, I no longer feel like someone can pull the rug out from under me. I feel rooted in God, come what may. That's kind of what we're waiting for, is come what may. I know what the truth is, and I know who God is, and I love my child, and I love God.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. What if you're a parent who had a kid who came out and you blew it? Like,
it happens.
What do you do?
Yeah. Well, I think apologize as soon as you can, but let's make sure that apology is not some superficial, sorry, I hurt your feelings, right? We want to really get down, and we want to be broken about that sin. Because just like those people who were Bible thumping me at my first gay pride parade, our message might have been right, but the way we went about expressing that message was so wrong that we can lend toward lots of shame and distortion in that response to our children. We want to get really broken about misrepresenting God and his love to our kids. Once you're in that space of brokenness, then you can go to your child and genuinely, authentically say, I am so sorry. If I were you, this is how I would feel. X, Y, Z, right? I apologize for this, that, and that. And then you want to build a temporal boundary, because you probably still have some stuff to work through, right? So you're going to say something like, look, there's a lot to unpack here, a lot for us to talk about. I really want to understand more of what you're experiencing. I need some time to process through this. Let's meet back up next week or next month, right? Whenever makes sense for us. And let me turn to God in the meantime, turn to my spouse if I have one, turn to my little support system to hold up my arms in this, to really work through my big emotions. And then I can come to you unburdened by that fear And then we can talk about what are the boundaries, or help me understand your experience, or whatever else needs to be talked about there. But we also don't need to freak out every little twist or turn our child's journey takes. God is using all of that. Sometimes we think it's up to us to convert our children. I like to relieve parents and say, actually, God doesn't need you to woo your child. You're an important cog in this journey, of course, but even if you weren't here, God would still pursue your child wholeheartedly. That's not up to you.
If you have an adult child who's living in a gay lifestyle, and let's say now it's coming home, let's say you've got younger kids, how do you approach that conversation of what do boundaries look like in our home if your behaviors don't match our home values?
Yeah, I think that's a process, right? I work with a lot of parents who at stage 1, they're like, our boundaries are really strict, right? And then by stage 12, they're like, hey, you can bring your girlfriend or your boyfriend to dinner. You can't sleep in the same room, right? Can't spend the night, whatever it is, right? I think those boundaries are going to look different from family to family, child to child, because they majorly depend on a parent's conscience. What I would say to any parent in that situation is you can't control what your child is doing. Of course, if they have autonomy, right? They're over the age of 18, they're not living in your home. You can't tell them you can't date someone of the same sex. You absolutely do have some control in your home, right? Especially if you have younger children. You can say, hey, I love you, I respect you. But when you come into our home, we ask that you maintain these values. We're not going to ask you to pretend. We're not going to ask you to believe what we believe in the confines of our home. But we are going to ask you to respect our boundaries in these areas. And so I think it starts with a vulnerable, transparent, loving, respectful conversation with your adult child to say, I love you, I respect you. Here's our boundaries when you come over. And then I also think it involves a loving, respectful, transparent conversation with your younger child to say, hey, your older brother or sister, and you follow that same template, is living this way in the way of the world. And this is what's common in our world. This is the way that God calls us to live and the values that we have in this house. This is how we're going to love your brother or sister no matter what, and how we're going to treat them, even though we don't agree with everything in the way that they're living.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the things that you talk about is sexual fluidity. This is an idea that honestly I'd never even heard of till I heard the first podcast I heard of with you on it, and you started talking about sexual fluidity in women, and I was like, I've got 5 women or 5 girls in my house, and I was like, I've never heard of this before. Help us wrap. Maybe others are like, I've never heard of this. What in the world is this?
Yeah. So this is like my first love, right? I do this for a living, but my first love was better understanding my own experience and my sexual attraction, which involves female sexuality. And yeah, you're right. Historically, we've studied male sexuality and we've applied that to female sexuality. And really just in the past maybe 15, 20 years, we started to realize, maybe they're a little bit different. And so there's been some really fascinating discoveries about female sexuality. It's much more fluid. It's much more broad than we previously thought, and even than male sexuality. So, we referenced before that there's a study done about sexual stimuli, and they hooked up brain imaging equipment to both men and women, and they found that generally men were only sexually stimulated by sexual stimuli that they were oriented towards. So gay men were, aroused by other men, and heterosexual men were aroused by women. But they found that women have the ability to be sexually aroused by any sexual stimulus, male or female. And so this is a huge discovery about female sexuality. It means that women have the ability to be sexually aroused by any sexual stimulus. Not that we most certainly will be aroused by every single thing we see, right?
But more often
than
the
not.
case.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I think a lot of men are probably feeling, a lot of husbands are feeling gypped, like, wait a minute, I thought it was the opposite, right?
Yeah.
But so I just like to put that caveat in there. It's not that we most certainly will be aroused by everything we see, but that we have the ability to be.
Yeah.
And I think it's also much more broad. They did this other study, a 10-year longitudinal study on female sexuality, and they found that women will actually change. It seems like they're changing who they're attracted to throughout the course of 10 years. And when they change, it usually broadens rather than narrows their potential range of attractions. So I think what makes sense, just based on my own anecdotal experience in working with people in this area, is that because women's attraction is usually governed by their emotional connection, that's what makes it seem like we're changing who we're attracted to all the time. Because it really depends on how safe we feel, how connected we feel with another person. So understanding this is key to understanding, especially our young daughters who are growing up. Because what I wish I knew growing up is that when I watched a commercial with a half-naked woman in a bikini running on a beach, to advertise perfume or beer or whatever, that when I felt sexual arousal over that commercial, which is an automatic response that happens in the brain, not something we have any control over. My brain perceived that stimuli as sexual, and therefore my body responded with blood flow. When I had that automatic reaction, it wasn't necessarily because I was attracted to women generally, maybe, but it also was very normal, very typical for any woman, heterosexual or homosexual, to have that experience. So I think it's really important that we teach our young girls, especially this growing up, that just because they feel more emotionally connected to their female peers, or they might even feel physical or sexual arousal over another woman, that doesn't necessarily always mean that they are gay.
Right. And I think that's the most important piece. If scientifically you're able to go, women can be sexually aroused by women and men kind of equally, that I think how the enemy can get in there so quickly and twist that, especially in a young woman, if all of a sudden they have a sexual arousal to another woman or an ad, that they might just go, oh, well, that means I'm fill in the blank. I'm gay, I'm bi, I'm whatever, as opposed to going, no, I'm a female.
Exactly. Yeah.
And but then how do I maneuver this? Like, what do I do with that emotion to be able to go, okay, well, that just means I'm a female.
Yeah.
But it doesn't define my identity.
Right.
And in this day and age, in our culture today, that is so really pro-gay. I think what's happening is, and you can just correct me or get me back on track, but I think there's a lot of almost a push to, well, go and explore that.
Yes.
Go, just try it out then. So talk about the danger of trying out something like that. You talk about the neurological pathways and things like that, especially first experiences. So walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. So there's an old adage in therapy, in the psychological world, that says neurons that fire together wire together, right? So I always use this example. If little Timmy was in his room alone and bored after school one day, and that's the first time that he watches pornography, those neurons that, fire together are going to wire together. The next time little Timmy is in his room alone and bored after school, his brain is going to say, I know what we do. We watch pornography when this happens, right? And so every time we engage in a pattern of thinking or behavior or emotions, we form a neurological pathway. So I like to think about it like a snowy hill, right? When you sled down a hill, it creates a little groove in the snow. And then when you get back up to that snowy hill and sled back down, it creates a deeper groove.
Yeah.
So every time we engage in a pattern of thinking, behavior, emoting, we create a neural pathway. And the more we go down that pattern, the more we create these grooves in our brain. Now, our brain is very plastic. God made our brains very malleable, and our brains actually do go through a pruning process. So when we don't use a neural pathway for a long period of time, our brain will say, oh, we don't need that one anymore.
Yeah.
But the more we've gone down it in the past, the more rooted
that thing is.
Exactly.
Yep.
So this is where addiction comes in, right? This is why when they're in recovery, they say I'm in recovery, not I'm recovered, because that neurological pathway is always there, no matter how long it's been since you've had that drink or that substance. So for me, my first sexual experience was with a woman. And so my brain, those neurons fired together and they wired together. It created a neural pathway, and it said, when you have a deep, intimate, loving sexual relationship with another human, it's with a woman. That neurological pathway is there. I'm not sure it's ever going to be pruned. I'm not sure it's ever going to go away. Now, I haven't gone down that pathway in a really long time. And so that temptation isn't as strong. That pull isn't as strong as it used to be. But I'm aware that it's always there. And I need to really put some, right? The Bible says, throw off the sin, but also everything that hinders. So I want to be careful that I put some boundaries in my life so I'm not tempted to go down that old snowy hill like I once did.
Yeah.
So, I do think that, we have neural pathways. We have to be careful, especially with our young girls growing up. Our first sexual experience is a big part of our environmental influence that makes up that cup that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But what's great news, like for me, is it can't be undone. It can and it can't, right? I can't undo what I've done. I can't get rid of that neural pathway in my head, but I can still have a fulfilling, healthy relationship with God, with my husband, live according to God's way, not perfectly, but wholeheartedly, even with that neural pathway there. So I think we want to keep that in mind as parents, that it's not what if, but even if, right? Even if my child does engage in this sin and fuses those neural pathways, they're not all is lost, right? God is above it. He's more powerful than that. We never want to get stuck in that fear, because if we do, then that's going to come out to our kids. We're going to parent based on fear, not based in love, and we're going to really miss the boat of introducing our kids to God and his love. Instead, we're going to introduce them to his standards, and out of fear, try to get them to behaviorally comply with it.
Yeah. So well said. You talk in your book about the, at least this is how I sense how you communicate, is you play the long game in parenting.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that, because I think every parent needs to hear this, that if your kid's blowing it today, or your kid's living in a lifestyle that you don't agree with today, not all hope is not lost. Like, you have to play the long game.
It's so true. And I'm honestly, this was a big surprise for me when I started working with Christian parents of LGBTQ kids, is that people would say, my 14-year-old, my 16-year-old said that they're gay. And I'm just, I'm so sad. I can't believe this is going to be their life forever. And I thought, wait a minute, they're 14, they're 16. When I was 16 years old, I have 3 brothers, 2 that are 12 and 14 years younger than me. And I remember being a teenager thinking, I will never have kids. Because I grew up like you, right? You have a big span. I grew up with seeing the chaos that kids can bring to a home without having the maturity to understand the benefit, the joy of having children. So at 14, 16 years old, I was like, I am never having kids. And my parents said, we'll see how you feel when you're a little bit older. We'll see if this sticks or not. And that's not how all parents see this. And I get it, right? This topic, LGBTQ topics, are so much more emotionally charged in our world. And so, but when their 14 or 16-year-old is saying, I'm gay or I'm trans, they're reacting as if this is a fully formed brain saying, I have carefully thought this out and this is what I've decided for the rest of my life. Instead of what's really true is an unformed brain who doesn't fully understand themselves, God, the world around them, saying vehemently, right, like, this is what I've chosen for my life. And I think it would do us well as parents to say, okay, I hear you and I can validate how you feel in this moment, while still keeping in mind that you're still forming your idea of who you are, who God is, what you believe, what you want out of life. And so I'll take that into consideration as I quell my own emotions in this. And I think zooming out, I think that's more so God's perspective, zooming out. And he doesn't freak out at every piece of sin we get engaged in. He's like, hey, I want you in the end. And if that means you have to take this twist and turn and you have to go on this bump and get that bruise, I'm willing to sacrifice that. I'm willing to be with you in that if it means that ultimately you come to me. So I think sometimes as parents, we don't want to freak out every bump or every bruise our kid gets on this spiritual journey. Instead, we want to say, what can God do with that? How can he use that? How can he use that to pull my child to him instead of, oh no, they're not behaviorally complying with my faith tradition.
This minute, we've got to get it back on track in the next month.
God can use even our brokenness to draw us to him. In fact, right, like my story, can you imagine if my parents in my loneliness in Ireland, right, if they had said, we're gonna take this loneliness away from you, we're gonna come there and fly and bring you back home, that would have really disrupted my connection with God. So I'm not saying we need to have a hands-off approach as parents. We certainly need to implement boundaries, absolutely. Right. But we also don't need to freak out every little twist or turn our child's journey takes. God is using all of that. Sometimes we think it's up to us to convert our children. I like to relieve parents and say, actually, God doesn't need you to woo your child. You're an important cog in this journey, of course, but even if you weren't here, God would still pursue your child wholeheartedly. That's not up to you.
Well said.
All
right, final set of questions. Okay, different type of thing, or different subject. Want to talk about identities and transgenderism, gender dysmorphia. You deal with all of that as well, and you do counseling in that. Help us talk through kids identifying even as animals and things like that. Like, how is that similar to, let's say, transgenderism? How is that different?
Well, I like to break it up in my own brain. Probably I get a lot of pushback from this from people in the field, but in my own brain, I like to break it up. When an adult, someone with a fully formed brain says, I have gender dysphoria, I want to transition to live as a different gender. To me, that's one issue. And there's lots of different reasons someone could deal with gender dysphoria. And we kind of have to dive into that, right? Then another aspect of this is a teenager saying, I am, unhappy with my gender, and I quickly want to join the LGBTQ community as a trans individual. To me, that's sometimes a little bit different. It's not to say they're not really experiencing gender dysphoria. I think that could be very valid. I think what's usually at the heart of that I've seen is it's less about what they are or what they experience. It's more about who they are. And so if that's the case, then this is an identity issue, which is something we all can relate to. We all have identity issues before we came to God and even after that we're constantly trying to bring into the lens of God. And so I think that this gets a little less scary when we can say, whether you're identifying as a different gender, an animal, or whatever, you are having an identity crisis, an identity issue. And that's not easy, but it is simple to deal with, right? Because the truth is, who are you? You are God's. Let me bring you back to the source and tell you who God is. You were created in his image. The more you understand about him, the more you'll understand about you and how he sees you and what he says he wants from you and his standards from you. So this actually gets a little bit simpler when we say, this isn't, no, you're wanting to identify as a different gender. You're wanting to identify as an animal. You're wanting to identify as a color, whatever. No, this is, you're wanting to identify as something other than God's child. And anything that's outside of that isn't going to fulfill you. It might take the edge off, and I want to validate that, but it's not going to fulfill you the way that God created you to be fulfilled. It's not going to fill that deep longing hole in your heart.
So is that how you would start any conversation with someone who's starting with or who's exploring or talking about transgender? Is always about identity?
Yeah, I would start by trying to draw out the story, right? I wouldn't start with, let me tell you about your identity.
Right.
Help me understand what's really going on here, right? Because that's going to build the connection. In therapy, we call that joining. You're going to want to join with that person and say, unpack this for me. Help me understand. Ask those open-ended questions to draw out the story. And by doing that, you start to see the underlying desire. Why is it that you want to identify as a man or a woman? What is it that identifying as an animal would offer you, right? Or a color? What would that offer to you? Because we don't just want to refute what they say, right? Cancel out what they say. We want to really understand and say, these underlying desires that you have to be different, to be bold, to be pursued, to be wanted, those are good. That's in line with how God created you. But this is not going to fulfill you in the way that this will, a relationship with God. So we want to recognize those desires, those underlying desires, validate them, and then point them to the ultimate source to get those needs met, which is a relationship with God.
Are there common hurts, struggles that are often a part of a root, often a root of someone who's dealing with transgenderism?
Well, what I see in adults that are dealing with this, sort of a common environmental factor might be sort of what I experienced, feeling uncomfortable with your gender identity, your femininity or your masculinity growing up, feeling very different than your same-sex parent. That's something I see a lot. Often sexual trauma is a big key factor in there as well. And sometimes those things aren't a part of it, right? And sometimes it's something totally different. One of the key factors that I've seen with what we would call rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is more so teenage girls, but just teenagers in general identifying as trans very quickly and unexpectedly. Sort of where this is happening most is in middle-class white families.
Really?
And so sort of a key factor is, right, in our society, we really value oppression and malignment. That kind of gives you an automatic boost in your social, circle.
Yeah,
right?
if you're the underdog.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you're a white middle-class family, you don't really have much to associate there with alignment, being maligned and feeling oppressed. And so when you identify as part of the LGBTQ community as a white middle-class female girl, that automatically boosts you up in your social circle, right? Already you have this social clout that you didn't have just yesterday. So I'm not saying that's the case for all teenagers identifying this way. And I'm not suggesting that gender dysphoria is not a part of the equation, but what I've seen is it has more to do with identity, and usually it has to do with a sense of not feeling different enough. Yeah.
That's fascinating. On transgenderism, how does the church effectively and uniquely minister there?
Well, first, I think it's messy, right? Like, we don't like things to be messy. We like things to be clean. I grant you, if a trans person walked into our church, it'd be really uncomfortable. And I think we need to be okay with that discomfort. If we live according to God's standard, there's going to be a lot of discomfort, right? If the way that Jesus lived, engaging with prostitutes and sinners and tax collectors, there was a lot of discomfort in his ministry and among believers at that point. And so I would say if we don't have some of that discomfort, we might not be doing it right? right?
Yeah.
You might need to really examine that because there is going to be discomfort. I think what's so powerful about the stories that I've heard and that I've seen with churches walking alongside trans individuals in this journey of faith to God is that they didn't have to have all the answers. A lot of times trans people come to a church and say, I want to know more about God. And then the more that they fall in love with God, they say, oh no, I think I might need to detransition. What would that look like? And the people at the church say, I don't know, but let's figure it out together, right? I don't think we need to have the answers. Doesn't need to be clear cut. I think what's most important is that we are rooted in the truth. We know who God is. We know who they are before God. We introduce them to a deep, loving relationship with God, and we're open to walking alongside of them, even if it gets a little messy.
Yeah, I think that's such the key. I mean, at least what I grew up in was almost like fast, immediate behavior modification. Like, let's align everything perfectly quickly.
Yeah.
So on the day you give your life to Christ, everything should get sorted quickly.
Yeah.
You know, because now you're a Christian. And yet that's rarely the case.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe the best thing that people just need to hear is allow it to be a process.
Allow it, especially if it involves detransitioning from a different gender, right? This is a really taxing emotional, physical, mental, but also financial journey, right? And so, I think it would be very dangerous and not very realistic to expect that the day someone decides they love God enough to live for him, that they would all of a sudden live as their natal gender, right? Their natal sex. That would be nice. And that might happen sometimes, but also it's a process. It's a journey. I think what's more important is that the belief changes, right? We need to repent of that old way, that old belief. But, changing your wardrobe and going, getting off hormones, all of that is going to have to be doctor run and, a process to make it as healthy and safe for that person detransitioning as possible.
Yeah. What if you're a parent and you've got, let's say a 13-year-old who says, I want to transition and all my friends are encouraging me and I've got a teacher maybe who has said, yep, if that's how you identify. But you as a parent, you're like, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not going to pay for this. I'm not behind this.
Yeah.
I think your brain is still in development. Yeah. I biblically don't believe that's who you are. Like, how do you coach a parent in that situation?
Yeah, well, walking parents through this really depends on their family culture, certainly their personal conscience before God, but also the age of their child, right? It's very different when a 12, 13-year-old comes to you and says, I'm trans, I want to transition. Right. And a 17 or 18-year-old, it's a very different approach. Yeah. So if your child is younger, or even in that preteen stage, I would say they're still under the values of your home, right? On the whole, right? And again, a lot of it depends on what's happening in that child's life. If this child is suicidal, then I don't think that needs to alter your conscience, but I think that's going to alter how you go about communicating with your child around this. So it really just kind of depends on the situation. But I think more so for children of, or parents of younger children in general, we want to find a way to still get to know them, really understand those underlying desires, validate them in that, but then lay out appropriate boundaries that they are beholden to in our home. And we can negotiate that a little bit. What are some ways where you might lessen your discomfort in your gender, right? Can we get you baggy clothing? Can we get you a couple sports bras, right? Like whatever will help in that, but still is within the confines of our boundaries and our values in our home.
Yeah, that's well said. What's one question is there anything that we haven't tackled that you're like, we've talked about a lot, but this is one thing that I just think you need to also consider or be aware of, think about?
Well, I would say what we need to be aware of in terms of what's coming down the pike, right?
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my questions.
Okay.
No, I forgot about it. So I'm so glad you went there.
Well, I think us as Christians and us as parents, we're not so good at getting on top of things, right? Like we talked about reflecting, getting on top of things in your own home and your family. But even as Christians, we're not great at staying on top of the culture. We're better at reacting in fear and judgment to what's happening. And so let's learn from this and say, all right, what's coming down the pike here, right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was more so sexuality. Now it's more so gender. What's coming down next? I think it's going to be a few things. One, polyamory, right? We're going to look lots of, I'm sure you've heard of like thruples, right? Or non-monogamous relationships. Yeah. That's coming down the pike. Our kids are seeing that. They're going to be encountering that. Also, sex with robots. That's coming down the pike. Imagine, right? This is going to be advertised to us as something wholesome. Oh, instead of engaging with sex trafficking through pornography, you can buy this really expensive robot and have all your desires met through that, right?
Yeah.
So, and then I would say also, pedophilia isn't far behind, right? If you can grow, we can say, I'm born this way and therefore God's okay with it, then we can say, I was born attracted to little children and there's nothing I could do about it, right? So I don't think that one's so close in our future. I think polyamory is the next frontier, then maybe sex with robots, and then further down the road, pedophilia. But I would say what's important here is we don't need to have the answers to every single sect of this, right? We don't have to say, how do we handle answers around sexuality and then gender and then sex with robots and then polyamory? No, the answer is all the same. It all comes back to the same principles we've talked about today. Knowing God, a relationship with God, knowing who we are in his image and our identity, and falling in love with him, not about behavioral compliance. All of that trumps every single piece of temptation or sin that we live in our fallen world.
I'm just going to plug your book again because I think it is so good. Love covers over. You need to buy it. Your website again is
heartsetabove.com.
heartsetabove.com. So tons of great resources there. Everyone give it up for Ellen. What a great time.
Thank you. An honor to be here with you guys. Thank you.
It's been so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.